The principal humiliated a poor student by asking her to play the piano as a joke, but no one expected what happened next. Welcome to Mystic Stories. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue sharing heartwarming stories that remind us that talent knows no bounds. At the prestigious Wellington Academy, where appearances weighed more than any merit, a small gesture of arrogance was about to unleash something that no one would ever suspect. It was the first day of school for Isabella Navarro, a dark-skinned girl with a serene face and modest clothing. Her grey t-shirt was somewhat worn. Her jeans had a small tear at the knee, and her sneakers showed clear signs of having been through several battles. Isabella walked through the wide marble hallways of the academy as if she were treading on forbidden territory. At every step, she felt the stares of students in impeccable suits, children of wealthy families who had been studying there for generations. No one said a word, but their eyes spoke for themselves. "You don't belong here." Her grandmother, Doña Carmen, had cried with joy when they received the news that Isabella had been accepted with a full scholarship. In her neighborhood, a place forgotten by time and the authorities, this opportunity was like an unlikely light in the midst of so much darkness. Isabella promised that she would not disappoint that sacrifice. When she arrived at classroom 3B, she took a deep breath before pushing the door. The noise ceased immediately. Each student turned their head to look at her like someone looking at a stain on a new fabric. "You in the back?" the teacher ordered without even asking her name. As Isabella crossed the room, she heard whispers. "Are you sure it's the one with the scholarship?" A girl with perfectly coiffed blonde hair commented, "Look at her shoes." Another added with a cruel chuckle. Isabella lowered her head, remembering her grandmother's words. "Lift your head, child. You are worth as much as anyone else." But sometimes the weight of the glances was too much. During the first few hours of class, she remained silent, carefully taking notes and avoiding any eye contact. No matter how hard she tried to be invisible, it seemed that her mere presence was reason enough to be judged. During recess, she sought refuge in a secluded corner of the courtyard. She took out of her backpack a bean cake wrapped in paper, aluminum foil, and a bottle of warm water. While she ate in silence, she watched the football games the other boys played on the perfectly manicured lawn, as if they belonged to a world inaccessible to her. It was then that a shadow fell over her. Isabella looked up and saw the director of the academy, Mr. Henderson, a man in an impeccable suit, perfectly combed grey hair, and a smile full of superiority. "Do you play an instrument, girl?" he asked in a voice that left no room for comfort. "Yes, sir, a little piano," Isabella replied, looking down. The director raised an eyebrow, as if that answer were a private joke. "Interesting," he said simply, before turning on his heels and walking away, leaving behind an air of mockery that Isabella couldn't quite understand. That night, in her small apartment with peeling walls, Isabella didn't mention anything to her grandmother. She preferred to tell her that her first day had been quiet. She didn't want to worry her. After dinner, like every night, she went down to the basement of the building, where an old out-of-tune piano that a neighbor had abandoned years ago was waiting for her. The yellowed keys creaked under her fingers, but for Isabella, that place was her sanctuary. There, poverty, harsh looks, and prejudice did not exist. There was just her music, and the dreams she refused to let go of. The following days at Wellington Academy were no kinder to Isabella. Every corner seemed to remind her that she didn't belong there. Conversation ceased when she passed by. The murmurs, the stifled giggles, the shifty glances, everything formed an invisible wall that isolated her even further. She took refuge in books, in her notebooks, in her music. She never responded to provocations, but every comment, every laugh left little cracks in her heart. In her neighborhood, she had learned to withstand the storms, but loneliness inside that elitist school was a different battle. One Wednesday morning, music teacher Mrs. Morales announced that there would be an artistic presentation during the welcome gala for the new parents. It was a tradition. The students had to showcase their talents, reinforcing the cultural prestige of the institution. Mr. Henderson, in a casual but purposeful tone, suggested that Isabella be the one in charge of opening the event with a piano piece. The news spread through the corridors like wildfire. Some boys laughed openly. "This is going to be epic," joked Thomas, the leader of the football team. "She will dare to play on that Steinway piano. Let's see if she doesn't break it," another added, laughing. Isabella listened to everything, feigning indifference. But inside her, a knot tightened more and more. She knew perfectly well that this was not an honor. It was a trap, a cruel joke disguised as an opportunity. That afternoon, as she walked home, her steps were heavier than ever. Every word, every look played back in her mind like a bitter echo. Upon arriving, she found her grandmother preparing rice and beans with the same love as always, as if the world were a less harsh place within those four walls. "How was it today, child?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Fine, Grandma," Isabella lied, forcing a smile. But that night, sitting in front of the old piano, the truth emerged in the form of notes. She played as if she wanted to tear away the sadness from within. Each melody was a sigh, each chord a tear that she didn't let fall in front of anyone. She remembered Doña Carmen's words on those afternoons of music in the neighborhood. "Don't play to please others, Isabella. Play to tell your truth." That's when she made a decision. It didn't matter if they wanted to laugh at her. It didn't matter if they looked at her as an oddity. She would play, but not for them. She would play for herself, for her grandmother, for her history, and although the fear continued to beat in her chest, something new began to grow inside her, a silent, invincible determination. Friday arrived faster than Isabella would have liked. From early on, the atmosphere at the academy was different. Students in immaculate uniforms walked through the halls enthusiastically, preparing their dance, theater, or singing performances. For them, the gala was a party. For Isabella, a sentence. When the clock struck 5 p.m., parents began to arrive. Luxury cars lined up at the main entrance. Men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses filled the auditorium decorated with white and gold flowers. Every detail spoke of opulence and tradition. Behind the scenes, Isabella was breathing deeply, her hands sweating. She was wearing her best clothes, a slightly oversized white shirt and a pair of pants inherited from her older cousin. There were no expensive brands, but there was dignity in every fold. Mrs. Morales approached and lightly patted her on the shoulder. "I trust you, Isabella. Make it feel like you're at home," she said with a warm smile. But before she could answer, Mr. Henderson took the microphone on the main stage. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our traditional talent night. Today, to start," he paused, sarcastically, unconventionally. A few laughs escaped from the audience. Isabella felt her stomach tighten. "Let's give a big round of applause to our newest scholarship student, Isabella Navarro." The applause was scattered, some genuine, others laced with barely concealed mockery. Isabella walked to the center of the stage, feeling every glance like a weight on her shoulders. She sat down in front of the majestic Steinway piano that gleamed under the auditorium lights. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember why she was there. It wasn't for them. It wasn't for approval. It was for Doña Carmen. It was for the nights in the basement. It was for every promise whispered into the old keyboard. She placed her hands on the keys. For a second, all the murmurs disappeared. There was only her and the music. The first notes were soft, almost shy, like a child peeking into the world. Then they slowly grew. The melody she chose was not well known, nor commercial, nor spectacular. It was a composition of her own, born from her memories, her fears, her dreams. In the auditorium, the murmurs died away, the smug smiles disappeared, and the hands holding cell phones to record jokes lowered in astonishment. Isabella's music had something that couldn't be faked, right? It was pure, honest, full of emotion. Each note was a page of her life, each chord a caress from her grandmother, each pause a sigh held for years. When she finished, there was no immediate burst of applause, just a thick, reverent silence, as if no one wanted to break the magic that had just been born in that place, until timidly a woman in the front row, a mother with silver hair and bright eyes, began to applaud. Soon, another joined, then another. In a matter of seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, clapping, cheering, crying for Isabella Navarro. But from the background, Mr. Henderson watched with pursed lips and a frown. This wasn't what I had planned, and the real change was just beginning. When Isabella stepped off the stage, her heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear she felt. This time it was something new, something she hardly dared to acknowledge: pride. The hallways behind the auditorium seemed longer than usual. Each step brought her closer to a reality she still didn't fully understand. Some teachers came up to congratulate her with surprised smiles. Other students, the same ones who days before had barely hidden their contempt, now looked at her differently, with respect, admiration, or discomfort. Among them, Thomas, the leader of the football team, looked down as Isabella walked by. He didn't say anything, but that simple gesture meant more than any words. At home that night, Isabella and her grandmother shared a simple but joyful dinner. "How did it go, my child?" asked Doña Carmen, serving her a generous spoonful of rice. "They played for my grandmother," Isabella replied. "This time, they listened to me." She smiled with that silent love that had been her shield throughout her life. No more needed to be said. But while Isabella slept with a light heart in the principal's office, Mr. Henderson plotted in silence. The plan to ridicule the scholarship student had failed miserably, and now, to his annoyance, the school community was talking about Isabella with enthusiasm. Comments like, "What a genuine talent, she's a credit to the academy, and we need more kids like that," circulated among parents and teachers. The perfect facade Henderson had built for years was beginning to crack, and he knew it. He couldn't allow a single child, let alone one from humble origins, to change the Wellington narrative. The following Monday, Mrs. Morales announced with a smile that Isabella had been invited to participate in the school arts club, a distinction reserved for the most outstanding students. In addition, the regional conservatory had shown interest in offering her a scholarship for advanced music studies. The news spread like wildfire. Some were genuinely happy. Others, like Henderson and his small circle of allies, began to frown. Things were also changing in the hallways. Isabella was still reserved, but she was no longer invisible. Now the greetings were more frequent. Now the doors were half open for her. Now her presence commanded a respect that had previously been denied her, but with light also came shadows. Behind the fake smiles and forced applause, a silent resentment grew. And Isabella, although she moved forward with a firm step, sensed that the real challenge was yet to begin, because some people did not accept losing their power so easily and were willing to do anything to recover it. The week after the gala felt different at Wellington Academy. There was an air of transformation floating in the air, almost imperceptible but real. Some students were more attentive, the teachers more receptive, and even the administrator's gaze seemed filled with a new curiosity. However, not everyone celebrated this change. From his office, Mr. Henderson watched every movement with growing irritation. For him, Isabella represented a threat, living proof that merit could emerge from where least expected, challenging the comfortable structures the school had preserved for years, and that could not be allowed. In a private meeting with some elected faculty members, the principal let slip his true intentions, disguised as concern. "We cannot allow the school to lose its essence. We must ensure that all students stay in their places." Although his words were measured, the message was clear. Shortly after, small incidents began to occur. The piano in the music room that Isabella used to practice appeared with broken keys one morning. Nobody knew how it had happened. Her sheet music, carefully stored in her locker, mysteriously disappeared. Even malicious rumors began to circulate, insinuating that her talent was exaggerated, that it had all been an emotional one-night stand. Isabella noticed all this, but chose to remain silent. Not because she didn't feel the injustice, but because she had learned that the true answer doesn't come with shouting, but with perseverance. Every afternoon after school, she continued practicing. On the old piano in the basement of her building. There, amidst the dust and out-of-tune notes, she found the strength to keep going. Doña Carmen, intuitive as always, noticed her more silent than usual. One night, as she poured her a cup of hot tea, she sat across from her and asked, "Is something wrong, child?" Isabella hesitated, but finally shook her head. "Everything's fine, Grandma. I'm just tired." She didn't insist. She stroked her hair tenderly and placed the tea on the table. She knew her granddaughter was waging silent battles that only she could fight. But she wasn't alone. What Isabella didn't know was that some teachers, led by Mrs. Morales, had begun to observe. They also noticed the obstacles, the stairs, the hurdles that arose out of nowhere. And although they couldn't prove anything yet, they began to plot a way to support her without exposing themselves openly, because they understood that Isabella wasn't just defending her right to dream. She was paving the way for all those who had never had a voice at that academy. And that seed, though small, had already taken root. The rumor that Isabella Navarro had left her mark on the talent show continued to travel through Wellington Academy like a persistent echo. However, while many began to admire her, others, silently led by the shadow of Mr. Henderson, wove invisible webs to trip her up. The small acts of sabotage did not stop. One day, Isabella arrived at the library to study and discovered that her name had been removed from the list of those allowed to access the music practice rooms. When she inquired at the reception desk, an indifferent secretary told her, "You must have made a mistake on your application." Isabella knew it wasn't true, but once again she chose silence. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. Instead of protesting, she asked permission to use the oldest piano, the one in a forgotten corner of the school with yellowed keys and a broken sound. There, in that corner where no one else wanted to be, Isabella continued to nurture her dream. However, obstacles were beginning to weigh. Every mocking look, every closed door, every malicious rumor were like little pins stabbing her spirit. There were nights when she was so tired that she could barely keep her fingers on the keys. There were days when she wondered if it was really worth fighting something so big. One rainy afternoon after school, she overstayed her welcome at the forgotten piano. Lost in her music, she didn't notice the school starting to empty. She played a melody of her own, a mixture of sadness, longing, and strength. It was then that a silent presence watched her from the half-open door. It was Mrs. Morales. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there listening with her heart in her throat. When Isabella finished, she looked up and saw her. She started, fearing a reprimand, but Mrs. Morales smiled. "What you do cannot be taught, cannot be bought, cannot be faked," she said, approaching. "Isabella, you have something this school needs more than ever." She looked down, used to distrusting praise. "Sometimes I don't know if it makes sense to continue," she confessed out loud. "Calm down, it makes sense," she affirmed. "But you should know that excellence always makes those who live by appearances uncomfortable." The conversation was brief, but it left a new spark in Isabella. She wasn't completely alone, and that spark, although small, began to rekindle the inner fire that was almost extinguished. That same night at home, Doña Carmen noticed something different in her granddaughter. While they were having dinner, Isabella, for the first time in days, told her everything. The missing scores, the sabotage in the music room, the rumors. Her grandmother listened to her in silence, without interrupting. When she finished, she took her hands firmly. "My child," she said with blinked-back tears, "when life closes all its doors on you, remember that you carry a key in your heart. That key is your talent, your faith, your dignity. No one can take it away from you." Isabella felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't fair, it wasn't easy, but in that moment she understood that her struggle was much bigger than a simple school rivalry. It was a battle to exist, to be seen, to be respected. And while new obstacles were brewing in the academy offices, something much stronger than hatred or resentment was brewing in Isabella's heart, an indestructible determination. Because there was something that neither Principal Henderson, nor his allies, nor all the tricks in the world could understand. True talent isn't just measured in perfect notes. It's measured in the courage to keep playing, even when everyone is waiting to see you fall. The following week dawned with grey skies and a dense humidity that seemed to stick to the walls of Wellington Academy. It was as if the atmosphere itself sensed the tension building within its glittering halls. The administration had announced a new institutional event, Arts Week, a traditional showcase where the best students in music, painting, and theatre performed before high profile. Guests, business leaders, politicians, and important donors from the city. For many students, it was a golden opportunity to obtain scholarships, contracts, or prestige. The news spread through the halls like lightning. Everyone knew who deserved to be at the event. Everyone knew who had excited the entire school weeks. Ergo, everyone knew it had to be Isabella, but when the lists of participants were posted on the mural in the central courtyard, her name was not there. Not in music, not in any category. It was as if it had never existed. The silence that followed was brutal. Some students, genuinely outraged, looked at each other for an explanation. Others, more cynical, simply shrugged their shoulders. That's how things are here. Isabella, upon reading the list, felt a cold emptiness take hold of her chest. For a moment she believed that all her effort, all her pain, all her talent had been in vain. That history would always be written by the same people. She stood in front of the mural for several minutes, without moving, without blinking, until a warm voice at her side brought her out of her trance. "It's not fair, Isabella, and we're not going to leave it like this," said Mrs. Morales, her music teacher, and she looked at her in confusion. She smiled, but there was a new firmness in her gaze. "Injustice only thrives when talent is silent, and you, child, have a lot to say." That same day, a small but determined group of teachers, including Mrs. Morales and history teacher Mr. Rios, began secretly organizing an alternative event, the true echo of the Wellington, an open concert in the school's backyard, away from the supervision of Principal Henderson. The idea was simple. If they didn't let her shine on the official stage, they would create their own stage, one where no one could censor her. The proposal circulated quietly among students and trusted teachers. More and more hands offered to help. Pupils, theatre, students, painters, anonymous musicians who also felt left out. It was like an undercurrent of freedom beginning to sprout beneath the surface of that ossified institution. Meanwhile, in the direction, Henderson noticed something moving, although he couldn't catch it. His instinct, honed by years of manipulation, told him that Isabella Navarro was not yet defeated, and that infuriated him more than he could admit. So he decided to act. Cold, calculating, cruel. He summoned Isabella to his office under the pretext of an orientation talk. The girl arrived punctually, her heart beating strongly in her chest. She sat down at the huge desk where the director with his usual fake smile greeted her. "Isabella," Henderson began, crossing his hands, "I've noticed your enthusiasm, but you need to understand something. Not all of us are born to be protagonists. Sometimes our role is to learn in silence." Isabella clenched her fists on her knees. She didn't respond. She didn't fall into the trap. "What I want to tell you," continued the director, leaning slightly forward, "is just that maybe it's better for you, for your future. Keep a low profile here. It's not in your best interest to make waves. Calm waters are the safest. Do you understand?" It was a threat wrapped in a thick layer, a warning disguised as fatherly advice. Isabella looked up, her dark, determined eyes stared into the director's. She didn't say anything. There was no need to. Her silence was a deafening cry of dignity. That night at home, while her grandmother was sewing a loose button on her shirt, Isabella made a decision. No matter how many doors they closed, no matter how many traps they set, no matter how many disguised threats she received, she was going to knock. And she would do it so everyone could hear it, so they could never again pretend she didn't exist. Isabella Navarro's story was just beginning, and now nothing and no one could stop her. The following days were a whirlwind of discreet movements, knowing glances and racing hearts. In the forgotten corners of Wellington Academy, students and teachers worked silently, preparing for what would be more than an event, a declaration under the direction of Mrs. Morales and Professor Rios. The true echo of Wellington was taking shape. They borrowed lights from the theatre room, chairs from the dining room, an old microphone that still worked, and a small upright piano that a family had donated years ago and was lying forgotten in a dusty storage unit. Nothing in every detail was improvised, but the spirit that permeated the preparation was authentic, vibrant. It was not an empty act of rebellion. It was a legitimate response to silenced voices, and Isabella, although she hadn't asked for it, became its symbol. The afternoon before the event, Isabella walked alone through the school gardens. The rumor of the clandestine organization had already spread beyond its small circle. It was said that curious parents would attend, that some local reporters had been tipped off, and that Principal Henderson was also planning retaliation. The pressure was brutal, but as the sun set and the shadows lengthened on the stone paths, Isabella remembered her grandmother's words. "Dignity is not negotiable, child. It is defended." That night at home, Isabella tuned the basement piano one last time with makeshift tools. It wasn't a perfect piano, but it was hers. It was the same instrument that had accompanied her sadness, her dreams, her childhood. She sat down at the worn keys and played until her fingers trembled with exhaustion. She wasn't rehearsing a famous piece, nor was she seeking technical perfection. She played what came from her soul, a nameless melody that spoke of struggle, of love, of memory, of hope. When she finished, Doña Carmen, who had heard her from the kitchen, approached silently. "Tomorrow, no matter what happens, you've already won, child," she whispered, hugging her tightly. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of that hug like armor against the cold of the world. She knew she couldn't control the outcome. She knew she could be ridiculed, disciplined even, expelled. But she also knew that not acting would be betraying herself, and that was something she wasn't willing to do. Friday dawned with a clear, deep blue sky, as if the universe itself were conspiring in favor of the small miracle that was about to happen. At 5 p.m., in the main hall of Wellington Academy, students selected by the principal displayed their talents in a rigid and perfectly choreographed performance. In the backyard, the real spectators were beginning to arrive. Curious parents, students in search of something real, teachers who no longer wanted to remain silent, independent journalists. Alerted by anonymous emails, the small makeshift stage shivered slightly in the breeze. The lights were humble, the sound was faulty, but the spirit was indestructible. And in the midst of it all, standing by the piano, her white shirt neatly ironed and her face serene, was Isabella Navarro waiting for her moment, ready to speak without words in a corner hidden among the trees. Director Henderson watched the scene, fists clenched in rage. He had lost control, and still couldn't imagine how much more he would lose that night. At 6 o'clock sharp, the back garden of Wellington Academy was packed. It was not a noisy or disorderly crowd. It was an expectant audience made up of attentive faces, hearts willing to hear something true. An almost sacred silence took over the place when Isabella walked to the center of the improvised stage. There were no heavy curtains or glaring spotlights, just a worn wooden piano, a few warm lights strung between the trees, and a gentle breeze that seemed to carry the dreams of everyone who had ever been ignored. Isabella sat down at the piano, took a deep breath, looked out into the audience, and saw her grandmother, Doña Carmen, in the front row, her eyes shining with emotion and pride. She also saw Mrs. Morales, Professor Rios, and colleagues she had barely known before, and now they looked at her like a sister in arms. She closed her eyes. She placed her fingers on the worn keys and began to play. The melody that was born was not perfect. It did not follow a famous score. It was hers. It was raw. It was deep. Each note seemed torn straight from her soul. It was the voice of her forgotten neighborhood. It was her grandmother's laughter on Sunday afternoons. It was the pain of every contempt, the loneliness of every corridor walked in silence. It was the hope that refused to die. The audience initially listened in respectful silence. But little by little, something else began to happen. They didn't just listen, they felt. Mothers from wealthy families, accustomed to frivolous social events, discreetly wiped away tears. Teachers, hardened by years of strict rules, hung their heads in shame at their own prejudices. Students who had previously laughed now pursed their lips, recognizing in Isabella something they had never had the courage to be: authentic. And in a corner, almost hidden in the shadows, Director Henderson watched the scene with growing desperation. His authority, his image, his small empire of appearance and control. Everything crumbled with each chord that flowed from those worn keys, because Isabella's music not only filled the garden, it filled the voids that years of exclusion had left in that school. It was impossible to pretend they didn't hear her. It was impossible to pretend that she didn't touch them. It was impossible to continue ignoring it. When the last note floated in the air and the echo of its music faded, there was a second of absolute silence, a heavy, profound silence. And then, like an unstoppable wave, the first hands began to applaud, first timidly, then louder, and then everyone standing, clapping, cheering, crying. Isabella sat for a moment longer, her head bowed, feeling her emotions overwhelm her. There were no prepared speeches, no trophies, no certificates, but in that heartfelt applause, she found everything she had been looking for since she set foot in that school: to be seen, to be respected, to be heard. When she finally stood up, her eyes met her grandmother's. She didn't say anything. There was no need to. Her smile was the biggest applause of all. And as the garden vibrated with emotion, as the teachers discreetly hugged each other, as the students applauded until their hands ached, Isabella understood a simple yet immense truth. She had changed history. She had broken the silence, and she would never be invisible again. The following Monday, Wellington Academy was no longer the same. Something invisible but irreversible had changed in the air. Hallway conversations no longer revolved around football games and summer trips. Now everyone was talking about the concert in the garden, about Isabella's bravery, about the emotion that still vibrated in their hearts. Even the most skeptical, the coldest, walked differently, more cautiously, more consciously. For many, Isabella's performance had been just an emotional spark. For others, it was the start of a silent fire that could not be extinguished. But in the main office, behind thick curtains and closed doors, Mr. Henderson seethed with rage. The night of the concert had been a public humiliation that he could not tolerate. And although on the outside he maintained his impeccable composure, inside he was hatching a desperate plan to crush the rebellion before it grew any further. He called an urgent meeting with the school's discipline committee. There, with cold documents and carefully chosen words, he proposed sanctioning all the students and teachers who had participated in the unauthorized event. The accusation was clear: violation of internal regulations, insubordination, and misuse of the institution's resources. But everyone knew that although disguised in technicalities, the real goal was to silence Isabella Navarro. The news spread like lightning, and this time, unlike previous occasions, the community did not remain silent. Outraged teachers began writing open letters. Parents, moved by the presentation, demanded explanations from the management. Even some popular students who had previously kept to themselves began to speak out in support of Isabella. In an act of unusual courage, Mrs. Morales organized an open meeting in the auditorium without the director's authorization. There, in front of dozens of students and parents, she told the truth, how Isabella had been blocked from the official event, how they had sabotaged her work, how they had tried to extinguish her talent from day one. Her testimony was like a shot, fired in the middle of a field of silence. It was no longer just about Isabella, it was about everyone who had once been invisible. That afternoon, management received an urgent notification. The school board and the Regional Education Inspectorate had been alerted. A formal investigation into the handling of scholarships, discrimination, and abuse of authority was expected to be launched at Wellington Academy. For the first time in years, Mr. Henderson felt the ground beneath his feet shake, and although he tried to cling to his image of power, it was too late. The tide had turned, and this time it was sweeping everything away. The following days were a whirlwind of rumors, urgent meetings, and awkward silences. Wellington Academy, accustomed to appearances and well-kept secrets, now found itself under public scrutiny. School board investigators began scouring the halls, reviewing documents, and interviewing teachers, students, and parents. Each statement, each piece of evidence slowly built a devastating mural. A systematic pattern of exclusion, favoritism, and humiliation towards scholarship students, all under Mr. Henderson's command. The director, who for years had walked haughtily around the institution, now avoided leaving his office. His face, once confident and haughty, had hardened, furrowed by suppressed anger and growing fear. Meanwhile, Isabella continued attending classes as usual, head held high, firm heart. She knew it wasn't time to celebrate yet. She knew that true resistance is fought silently in every small act of daily dignity. But something was different. Now, when she walked through the halls, she no longer received looks of contempt. Now, as she passed by, she heard whispers of admiration, words of encouragement. Now, some previously indifferent students greeted her with a genuine smile. It wasn't fame she was seeking, it was respect, and little by little she was gaining it. One morning, while she was studying in the library, Mrs. Morales approached her with a letter in her hand. "It's for you," she said, handing it to her with an excited smile. Isabella opened it with trembling hands. It was an official invitation from the National Conservatory of Music. A private audition with the possibility of a full scholarship based on the references that several of her teachers had sent after the concert in the garden. Isabella felt like she was running out of air. The opportunity she had never even dreamed of was now before her, not as a favor, not as a concession, but as legitimate recognition of her talent, her effort, her truth. That night in her small apartment, she shared the news with her grandmother. Doña Carmen hugged her tightly, unable to hold back her tears. "I always knew your music would take you far, child," she whispered, stroking her hair. "You just had to hold out a little longer than the world." The next day, the news spread like wildfire through the school. Isabella Navarro, the scholarship girl, the girl with the forgotten piano, had been summoned by the most important conservatory in the country. For some, it was a cause for celebration. For others, an uncomfortable slap of reality. But for Isabella, it was something deeper, a reaffirmation that she had never ever been wrong to follow her passion. Meanwhile, the investigation against Henderson was reaching its climax. The inspectors gathered irrefutable evidence: discriminatory emails, manipulation of scholarship allocations, and misappropriation of resources. The net was closing in. Finally, at a general meeting convened by the school board, the verdict was announced. Director Henderson would be removed from his position immediately and without appeal. The news broke like thunder. Students applauded. Parents nodded with satisfaction. Teachers looked at each other with relieved smiles. Isabella, sitting discreetly in a corner of the auditorium, didn't applaud immediately. She just closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't revenge that she felt, it wasn't hate. It was something much more powerful: peace. The certainty of having resisted without betraying herself, the satisfaction of having won, not with violence, but with dignity. And while everyone around her celebrated, Isabella Navarro understood deep down that her story was just beginning and that nothing and no one could stop her. A few weeks had passed since Principal Henderson's dismissal, and Wellington Academy was breathing a different air. Everything had changed overnight, but the foundations for a new era had been laid. New support programs for scholarship students were created, and inclusive art spaces were opened. Talks were organized on equality, diversity, and true respect, not as slogans, but as genuine commitments. And at the heart of that silent transformation, although she never sought it, was Isabella Navarro. The school organized a special event to close out the semester, a gala recognizing emerging talent. This time, there were no selective invitations or favoritism. All outstanding students were celebrated for real merit. When the day arrived, the Wellington Auditorium was packed. Entire families, teachers, alumni, even local reporters filled every corner. In the front row, Doña Carmen, radiant in her sky-blue dress and her eyes shining with emotion. When her name was announced, Isabella took the stage to heartfelt applause. This time, there was no hidden laughter, no cheating, no disguised humiliation. She sat down at the piano, the same grand piano that months ago seemed so inaccessible. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and played. The melody was different from all the previous ones. It was bright, vibrant, full of life. It was a love letter to her grandmother, to her neighborhood, to her silent struggles. It was an anthem to resilience, to dignity, to the power of not giving up. Each note seemed to caress the souls of those present. Each chord was a reminder that sometimes heroes don't wear capes or armor. They wear invisible scars, shy smiles, and impossible dreams that refuse to die. When it was over, there wasn't a single second of doubt. The entire audience stood up, with deafening applause, tears, and hugs. Isabella sat for a moment longer, her head bowed, feeling her emotions overwhelm her. Isabella sat for a moment longer, her head bowed, feeling her emotions overwhelm her. There were no prepared speeches, no trophies, no certificates. But in that heartfelt applause, she found everything she had been looking for since she set foot in that school. To be seen, to be respected, to be heard. When she finally stood up, her eyes met her grandmother's. She didn't say anything, there was no need to. Her smile was the biggest applause of all. And as the garden vibrated with emotion, as the teachers discreetly hugged each other, as the students applauded until their hands ached, Isabella understood a simple yet immense truth. She had changed history, she had broken the silence, and she would never be invisible again. The following Monday, Wellington Academy was no longer the same. Something invisible but irreversible had changed in the air. Hallway conversations no longer revolved around football games and summer trips. Now everyone was talking about the concert in the garden, about Isabella's bravery, about the emotion that still vibrated in their hearts. Even the most skeptical, the coldest, walked differently, more cautiously, more consciously. For many, Isabella's performance had been just an emotional spark. For others, it was the start of a silent fire that could not be extinguished. But in the main office, behind thick curtains and closed doors, Mr. Henderson seethed with rage. The night of the concert had been a public humiliation that he could not tolerate. And although on the outside he maintained his impeccable composure, inside he was hatching a desperate plan to crush the rebellion before it grew any further. He called an urgent meeting with the school's discipline committee. There, with cold documents and carefully chosen words, he proposed sanctioning all the students and teachers who had participated in the unauthorized event. The accusation was clear: violation of internal regulations, insubordination, and misuse of the institution's resources. But everyone knew that although disguised in technicalities, the real goal was to silence Isabella Navarro. The news spread like lightning, and this time, unlike previous occasions, the community did not remain silent. Outraged teachers began writing open letters, Parents, moved by the presentation, demanded explanations from the management. Even some popular students who had previously kept to themselves began to speak out in support of Isabella. In an act of unusual courage, Mrs. Morales organized an open meeting in the auditorium without the director's authorization. There, in front of dozens of students and parents, she told the truth: how Isabella had been blocked from the official event, how they had sabotaged her work, how they had tried to extinguish her talent from day one. Her testimony was like a shot fired in the middle of a field of silence. It was no longer just about Isabella. It was about everyone who had once been invisible.